Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Persis Karim. I'm the director for the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University. I want to welcome you all today. And before I introduce Professor Claudia Yaghoobi, I want to remind you that this event today will be recorded, and we will invite you to ask your questions after Claudia and I have a brief conversation after she gives a short presentation. So please put your questions in the Q&A where I will read them. And if there are multiple questions that are similar, I might condense them. Today's program is a joint effort by San Francisco State University's Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies and UC Berkeley's Center for Middle East Studies and the program at UC Berkeley in Armenian Studies. So we're delighted to have the institutional support of our sister campus down the road. And I also want to suggest that this event today is also very timely for this moment that we're living through. So I hope you benefit from Professor Yaghoobi's presentation. Claudia Yaghoobi is a professor of Persian Studies and the director of the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She is a scholar of Iranian Cultural Studies and Gender and Sexuality Studies with a focus on the members of sexual, ethnic, and religious minoritized populations. She's the author of, most recently, Transnational Culture in the Iranian Armenian Diaspora by Edinburgh Press, Temporary Marriage in Iran, Gender and Body Politics in Modern Persian Literature and Film, and Subjectivity in Attar, Persian Sufism, and European Mysticism. She received her Ph.D. in Comparative Literature from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and she currently teaches courses on Iranian literature and culture, Middle Eastern literature, gender and sexuality, diaspora studies, and human rights. Today, she'll be talking about her most recent book and drawing on her lived experience, as well as analyzing diasporic Iranian Armenian cultural productions. So without further ado, thank you, Professor Yaghoobi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karim. I want to thank the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at the San Francisco State University, as well as UC Berkeley Center for Middle Eastern Studies and the program in Armenian Studies. I also want to thank Professor Karim for engaging so thoughtfully today, as you will hear us talking about my book with my work, and all the staff in all these centers who have made the event possible. And all of you who are here to listen to my work. We usually, as scholars, work for years on something, and then we think that we put it out there and nobody is going to read or care. It is surprising and pleasant to see that so many people care and attend these events. I'm going to read some parts of the book. This is the book itself and the cover. The cover image is a painting by myself. I do some experiential painting, as you can see behind me too. This was my idea of transnationalism. Who knows why it just turned out to be like that. A little bit from the prologue of the book. I was born in Firuzgar Hospital in Tehran on November 20, 1974. For the first 8 years of my life, I grew up with my extended family, grandparents, aunts, and an uncle in the same house in the Heshmatieh Marbdash neighborhood in a single room with my parents. My oldest brother was born in 1978, but it was not until my sister was born in 1982, in the early years of Iran-Iraq war, that we moved to our own rental apartment in the Karim Khan Zand neighborhood near Haftatif. Later in 1984, my father managed to receive loans to purchase his first ever property in the Heshmatiya neighborhood where my grandparents used to live. So this is my parents, me in 1977. Before the revolution, I was 3 years old. At the beginning of the war, the war ended in 1988. My little brother was born in 1989. We moved to this new house in a new neighborhood in Narmak, Eastern Tehran, and hoped that this would be the end of our struggles. But alas, it was not. As Armenians who have survived much hostility at various junctures in history, it would prove an illusion to believe that life would become easier now that Islamic Republic was beginning to consolidate and prove its legitimacy via various exclusive policies. An enormous wave of Armenian immigration to the West, particularly to the US, began immediately after the war broke out. My maternal aunt's family, with whom I was very close, were part of this wave. They left in 1986. My aunt and uncle insistently encouraged my parents to take that leap of faith with them too. But alas, my father was not ready to do so as he had just purchased his first ever property in Iran. This is not an unusual predicament for a minoritized population, especially from a working class segment of society that has had to work so hard to secure the basic rights that their majority counterparts have had since birth. In part, this applies to work and employment opportunities available to the majority as well. It took us years to conclude that we wanted to leave. Human rights associations such as the Hayas or Hebrew Immigration Aid Society would take applications to help us get to the US as a Christian minoritized family from a Muslim majority country. But we were not to be so lucky. We submitted our application to Hayas in early September 2001, a week or so before the World Trade Center was hit and all immigration to the US was suspended until 2005. When the process resumed in 2005, my family's application was one of the first. 4 months later, we left Iran on April 29th, 2006 for Vienna, Austria. We stayed in Vienna for 4 months. Of course, they kept my parents and my younger brother for 5 more months. They were checking my father's military background or the military service. Were interviewed in the US Embassy, received our visa, and arrived at the Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, on August 17, 2006. Today, when asked where home is, as you know, I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Where home is, I first get confused. Sometimes I even consider Los Angeles my home, when in reality I want to refer to Tehran. Today, I think about home in the globalized world in which we live, where geographical borders matter little. However, even this hybridity and globalization come with their limits, which is something that I discuss in this book as well. I want to tell you a little bit about the ways that, the introduction of this book took me down the rabbit hole of finding more about my ancestry. My ancestors were most likely part of the group of Armenians displaced by Shah Abbas to New Julfa, part of Iranian city of Isfahan in the 17th century. They later migrated to Iraq and finally to Tehran. Many of the Armenians who ended up in Iraq were displaced by Shah Abbas from Western Armenia's Van region, which is in historic Armenia. Sources have documented that they later migrated from New Jolfa to other cities like Burvari also, including Arak. In Iraq, a group of these migrants settled in the Gurezar village of the Kazaz region, and my ancestors were part of this group. The first documented Armenian named Murad, called Armenian Murad, resided in Gurezar in the 1800s with his grandchildren. According to Hovik Minasyan's oral history fieldwork, in 1894, Avedis Torosyan moved from New Jolfa, Isfahan to Iraq to begin working at the Hudson Company. Gradually, between 1902 and 1903, others joined him there. They moved to Iraq in part because a branch of the rug-making Ziegler Company had been established in Iraq. Many artistic Armenians and craftsmen moved there to work for Ziegler, were hired, participated in the rug industry, and amassed wealth. In 1905, 8 families, that is 27 persons, lived in Iraq, but by 1913, this number had risen to 15 families. And Armenians had a significant impact on the rug industry in Iraq. In the absence of a family tree, I cannot determine when my ancestors migrated from New Jolfa to Gurezar in Iraq. I only know that they were among the displaced in the 17th century and that my paternal and maternal great-grandparents were in Gurezar at the time of the 1915 genocide. As it is with most immigrants, not everyone who moved from New Jolfa to Iraq was fortunate enough to be hired in the rug and carpet weaving industry. My great-grandparents engaged in farming, gardening, and ranching, and they led a traditional lifestyle. My father tells me that my great-grandfather, Jahangir Khan, was the chief or Kat Khoda of Gurezar village, who for some reason at some point ceded all of his power to his brother Qasem and donated his wealth to the poor. As you notice here, my great-grandfather's name Jahangir and his brother's name Qasem are not typical Armenian names, and this is an evidence of the historical influence of Iranian culture and how names were translated by name or birth registrars from Armenian into Persian or Arabic to make them sound more local. The same is true about my last name, which was Hakupian, translated into Yaghoobi. It's Hakop Jacob Yaghoob. Both of my parents were born in Gurezar. How and when they moved to Tehran is unclear, as they do not remember exact dates. From the dates they do remember, this migration to Tehran was most likely not part of the Armenian Nergacht, or the post-World War II Soviet policy of repatriation of the Armenian community, which means that my grandparents did not intend to return to Armenia. In Tehran, both families resided in the Heshmatiye neighborhood. What I know with confidence today is that at some historical juncture, my ancestors, who were probably from the one region of historic Armenia, were forced into displacement, relocated to New Jolfa in Isfahan, and ended up in Gurezar village of Iraq. This dispersion and other migrations, including to the US, throughout history, have shaped my ancestry today. Let me tell you a little bit, for those who don't know much about Armenians, about Armenian history and these migrations, both in Iran and in the US, because the book also covers the US in a comparative manner. Armenians have very deep roots as a collective historically persecuted and deprived of their homeland and nation. While many other diaspora communities leave their homelands due to natural disasters or for socioeconomic reasons, Armenians have been uprooted from their homeland as a result of centuries of persecution. According to Thomas O'Connor, and I'm quoting, "With strong national pride, fervent Christianity, a native language, and a distinctive culture, Armenians managed to survive conquests by Persians and Byzantines, the onslaught of the Seljuk Turks, and the brutal invasion of the Mongols, who drove hundreds of thousands from the Armenian plateau." End quote. In addition, Armenians also survived suppression under the Soviet Union and the massacres and genocide of 1915 by the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the area now considered Armenia existed under the rule of various nations and has almost always been the site of conflict between great powers. And this has prevented the establishment of a settled government in the region, making it quite impossible to speak of a united and continuous national Armenian presence. Nevertheless, Armenian historian Hrant Pastormajian conceptualizes the Armenians' historical position as intermediaries between East and West, especially with regard to the Persian Empire. And here's a quote from him: "A nation is not only a state and a frontier, it is above all a mission. In the case of Armenia, this mission was to serve as intermediary and interpreter between East and West." End quote. Hence, Armenians have been negotiating this chronic instability of a diasporic existence and the precariousness of existence in an occupied or lost homeland. Some of the different waves of Armenian migration to the West, to the US specifically. Armenians arrived as early as in the 17th century, when a few were brought to America to help grow silkworms. Armenian immigration to the US can be divided into three waves. The earlier wave from as early as 1618 until World War I, the post-World War I wave that included survivors of the 1915 genocide, and a third wave in the post-Coda era in 1965 of Armenians who escaped the political turmoil in Middle East, including the Iranian one in 1979 and during the Iran-Iraq War, and the post-1991 Soviet migrations. Significantly, Armenians in the US are heterogeneous diasporic population. There are also second and third generation Armenians born in the US who are children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of earlier migrants. This heterogeneity has also affected self-identification. When they arrived in the US, so the anthropologist Vered Talai describes, Armenian presence in American cities was characterized by quote-unquote relative anonymity, meaning that they decided to remain ethnically vague. While their dispersal across the US meant that they were exposed to less discrimination, it did not exempt them from stereotyping. Along with Jews, Greeks, Syrians, and American Japanese, they were stereotyped as, quote, too ambitious and with a crafty kind of self-interested intelligence, end quote. The congregation of Armenians in different cities and states in the US depended on a variety of factors. From the beginning, however, they had limited settlement choices, and while they were not exposed to explicit discrimination, in many places, their settlement relied on the permission of native residents of those cities or states. And of course, the situation in Fresno, California was very different. They were in fact exposed to overt discrimination. And you can read it in the book. Thank you. I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for kind of putting it in the context both of a history of Armenians in Iran and in the region, and also in the context of the US. I think that's one of the delightful things about your book, is that you put these two geographic and cultural locations into conversation with each other. And usually people often focus on Armenian studies holistically around Armenia and in the context of the Middle East, as opposed to comparatively. So, and I love that you read some of your personal biography, because before we started the Zoom today, I was telling Professor Yaghoobi that for me, it was really delightful to learn more about her family history, and also the ways in which her own biography have inflected in this book in a way that I think sometimes we pursue things because they have some extension of our own interests and passions. But I felt like in some ways you leaned into it, and that was really important, because in some ways you have not so much authority, but a sense of why this is important. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, in particular, the thing that you alluded to about Armenians having a kind of multiple consciousness. In your book, you talk about that at length, but also I think your presentation just highlighted that. That it depends on many things: when people came, what professions they're in, where they're located in Iran versus where they're located in the US. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what some of those multiple consciousnesses are and how they might impact how people see themselves.
Thank you. So the different types of, the different factors that play a role into the consciousness that each individual has can be from, the social class stratification you are in, or your gender, or, the kind of education you receive, where in Iran you lived. Even in Tehran, like where in Tehran you lived, we sometimes think that if you lived in Tehran, so you were in the center, in the capital, you had all the privileges and everything, but that's not true. And living in different places in Tehran or different neighborhoods made a difference in how your consciousness was being crafted or shaped. And the different places that people lived in Iran are also because of all the different waves of Armenian migration or displacement and dispersion to Iran, and how they have been, how they were relocated somewhere, and then gradually they started moving to different places. And then there is also the fact that, for example, one of the factors is religion. And while Armenians are Christian, not all Armenians are from the Apostolic Orthodox Church, right? The Armenian Gregorian Church. We did have in Qajar or in Pahlavi eras the missionaries and the conversions to Catholicism and Protestantism. So there is that factor too. And then the levels of education and access to education, employment, all of those also come into play. But when they come to the US, something that was my own observation also is in Iran, it's all Iranian Armenians. We did get a little bit, at least I and my family got a little exposure to Armenians from Armenia, but we still all spoke Eastern Armenian dialect. And we came to the US, and my family resided in Glendale. And then we had this exposure to the diversity of Armenians from all over the world, which speaks to the richness of Armenian diaspora in itself, but also to the Armenian diaspora and transnationalism, but also to the limits of that globalization and transnationalism, which is we both are Armenian, and we are, if you're speaking Western Armenian dialect, and I have had no exposure to it before, I'm having a hard time understanding. So we have to find this common language, which is ultimately English, to communicate with each other. So yeah, there are so many different factors, and this comparative aspect helps, situate both diasporas, and then in the larger diaspora context of Armenians dispersed in the world.
Wonderful. So Western Armenian and Eastern Armenian, are that distinctly different? Wow.
At least for me, I have I do understand a little bit of the Western Armenian now after 17 years of, being in the US and having the exposure. But when we arrived in Glendale, we had a hard time. It was my first time, even hearing that there was a Western Armenian dialect.
Thank you.
I would think that if we trace my ancestry back to the one region of historic Armenia, Western Armenian was the dialect of that place. But then my ancestors were brought to Iran. So that impact of the switch from Western Armenian to Eastern Armenian probably happened at some juncture, when they were exposed to Eastern Armenian.
I see. Okay. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Armenian experience, of course, is inflected heavily with both the idea of forced migration as a result of earlier periods in history, and then, of course, because of the genocide. But in the Iranian context, I wonder how the sort of longing for homeland or the accompanying pain and trauma of migration might have given rise to distinctive contributions both to Iranian culture or Iranian diaspora culture.
I'm going to share screen. I have a PowerPoint with some visuals. So when we talk about, diaspora, of course, longing for home looms large. And but for Iranian Armenians who are in diaspora in the US, that home becomes both Iran and Armenia. So they are like twice diasporic, double, a kind of stranger in the new host nation. And that in itself, lends itself into creation of new forms of cultural expressions and cultural productions. And we saw that with the 1970s, pop culture or pop music in Los Angeles, where we had Vegan, we have, Martik, we have Helen. And here's an example. We have Andy, who's singing, let's go to Armenia.
Claudia, you're going to have to share sound.
But then at the same time, he also has music about I'm going to Tehran.
I think you have to click share sound. Oh, well. Claudia.
So what I'm trying to show is that, basically that kind of cultural production or form of expression that represents that multiplicity of, the consciousness of this diasporic subject who comes from Iran, a diaspora in itself for Armenians, to the US, double diaspora, and creates these cultural forms of expression about longing and going back to the homeland in the language of that homeland separately, but then also in the US engages in English language with like Bon Jovi or other musicians, for example. So that already shows you or tells you all the multiple consciousnesses that are manifesting in different forms of cultural productions.
Okay. I just want to remind folks that you can put your questions in the chat and we'll get to them in a probably closer to 5:20. I have a few questions that I've prepared for Professor Yaghoobi. Your book also deals with both visual art and literature, including poetry. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of the examples that you've selected, why you selected them, and what are some of the themes that they articulate that you think are unique to the Armenian Iranian diaspora consciousness.
So the selection of the works was not easy, obviously, because there's the question of access. And the works are, majority of them were in Iran or libraries in Iran. So some of them I could find from Armenia, but the majority I had to have, I had very good friends who had a collection of those works, for example, the Armenian magazines like Noor Edge, who they shipped all of those from Armenia or from Tehran to me here in Chapel Hill. I received them in Chapel Hill. So the question of access was very important, but the way that I wanted to focus on cultural productions in this book was 1979 onward. I was not focusing on Pahlavi era or the Qajar period or before that. I wanted to look at the period where I have lived under the Islamic Republic and what has been produced, the things that were closer to me and dear and near to my heart. I did use some works which were produced before 1979 only because I saw those works as precursors to things that we see later thematically. And some of the themes that I chose to focus on were the themes that are the concepts which are important in the framing or construction of identity for different cultures, but also specifically for Armenians. For example, one chapter focuses completely on different ways of the manifestation of diaspora and the definition of diaspora for all the authors, poets, or artists who are Armenian. What does diaspora mean to them? And what does homeland mean to them? How are they referring to homeland, for example, in these different works? Many of them, refer to Hayastan, which is Armenia. Many of them refer to actually Nergacht and the repatriation time period. Many of them feel apologetic, or like they feel guilty and ask the homeland to forgive them for leaving the homeland. But then there are also works that consider both Iran and Armenia as homeland. Then another chapter focuses on the importance of language as a cornerstone of Armenian national identity. And the way that, these authors or their characters, basically, if they use Persian words or if they use English words, are reprimanded. Examples are from Zoya Pirzad's novels and stories, or the way that they speak about Armenian language with such praise, and they praise the purity of Armenian language. There's no other beautiful, language in the world as Armenian language. And then I also focused in another chapter on the collective consciousness of Armenians, including, folk stories or geographical locations such as Mount Ararat or Mount Masis or Arax River, and then obviously the 1915 genocide. That chapter, half of that chapter includes examples of the ways that the genocide, manifests itself into the works. And one chapter looks into the ways that the works are in conversation with global aspects or global artists, global writers, and how they become transnational, or how they become hybrid, because some of them are not globally in conversation, but they're in conversation with Iranian ethnic aspects. And then I did have a prologue, which was about the Iran-Iraq War and my childhood under the Iran-Iraq War. And the epilogue was a very interesting section of the book, which was, I was finishing the writing of the book in 2020, when around September 2020, when Azerbaijan attacked Armenia, Artsakh, for, I don't know, nth time. And at the same time, during that entire summer, we had the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. And then we were expecting to have the national elections, and, in the US. And in Iran, we all were signing petitions to save Navid Afghari's life, the wrestler. So when I started thinking about, okay, so this book is talking about transnationalism, and this is a solid example of how someone who is transnational, like myself, goes through when the countries that they are invested in, Iran, Armenia, the US, go through turmoil. So how's my world during that time? Or someone like me, not me per se, but someone like me. So it's a reflective, contemplative moment for me. And I find basically solace in my artwork, in my writing, in painting. And then the book went into production in September, I think, or October 2022. And the same started happening again. So in the US, we had the migrants, being discarded as if they are non-human, I don't know, animals or human animals that we hear today too. And in Iran, we had the uprisings with Jina Mahsa Amini and Life, Woman, Freedom. And again, Artsakh was under attack. And, the moment that I was writing about, I asked if I could add a section about that to the book. It was going under production last minute, and the publisher Edinburgh accepted for me to add one more paragraph. So I mean, it never ends. It's just continuous, you know. When you're transnational, you're torn apart, you are pulled into so many different directions, and those directions also are like the directions that you are being pulled are also as a result of all the different consciousnesses. Because as a scholar of gender, I'm pulled into gender studies as someone who teaches human rights and judicial systems in my classes. That is another aspect that I go into. So it is very taxing and difficult for anyone during those times who has that transnational identity.
Thank you. Very interesting. So of course, you talk about in your book the role of language and the role of Christianity as being sort of the benchmarks of Armenian identity, both whether in Iran and in the US context. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how you mentioned, for example, the question about Armenian, Western Armenian versus Eastern Armenian. But in some ways, people go through another set of questions about like, well, what does it mean to be an Iranian now in an Armenian context in the US? Because you get conflated with Iran, of course. So how does language and religion kind of, in some ways, keep you connected to that, either you personally or to Armenian communities more generally, either in Iran or here?
Yeah, so for any this is like in the scholarship already, for any crafting or shaping of national identity, factors such as, you know, language, religion, history, the past, all of this come into play. For Armenians, there is research that is out there. This is not my scholarship, or this is not what I say, but it makes sense. For Armenians, they have had two historical events, two important moments in history which have solidified their national identity, and it continues to this day. One is language, one is religion. And religion as Christianity, because it was in 3rd century when King Attar announced Christianity as the national religion of Armenia. Armenia is believed to be the first nation to accept Christianity as its national religion. And then, and that is in itself like a demarcation, placing a boundary that this is our, you know, national religion, and we are distinct from our neighbors. The other moment was with Mesrop Mashdod, who was a priest himself in 4th century, 405 Common Era. He invented the alphabet, Armenian alphabet. And it is believed that Mesrop Mashdod did that for the, you know, the circulation of Christianity amongst the Armenian population. But it became a very important moment in the history of Armenian identity and nationality. And then later, of course, you know, at the time of, it was classical Armenian. What we are talking about at that time was Grabar, or the classical Armenian. And then during the history, it switches, and there are so many changes, and vernacular also comes out of all these improvements or developments. So, you know, historically, the church and language, the church and educational institutions have been the anchor for Armenians. Now, if they are in Iran, that's the same. In Iran, we had Armenian only schools that were supported not by the state, but by Armenian donors or, Armenian endowments and Armenian prelacy. And we did also have the churches, Armenian Apostolic Church, which were the cornerstones or the anchors of Armenians in Iran. We come to the US and we see the same in the US as well. The difference is that in the US, the majority religion now is Christianity. So it doesn't need that much of demarcation that it needed from Iran to say that we are distinct, right? But in the US, what makes Iranian Armenians distinct from the other Armenians is the fact that if you go somewhere, governmental, or even if you are passing through the TSA at the airport, they want documentation. And if you show your passport or an ID and it says place of birth Iran, they don't know you're Christian. They put you in the category of Iran, and immediately you are exposed to Islamophobia and US's racism. So that's another thing to consider that is different for Iranian Armenians from other Armenians in the US. So again, the diversity of diasporic experience, even amongst Armenians themselves.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna turn it to some of the questions because we have a few and I want to make sure we get to them. There's two that are slightly related, not exactly, but Todd Seragino says, have you studied the migration patterns of Armenians in the Near East and its relationship to the 1915 genocide? And then there's also another question about maybe thinking about Lebanese Armenians and the differences from other Armenians in the US, if you can comment on those because they're sort of related.
So the question of migration patterns of Armenian in the Near East, I have not done that research. I have read things but not done the research myself. Mainly because my field of study is Middle East and Iran rather than Near East. And I only wrote this book because it's Iranian Armenians. So sorry, I have not.
Okay. All right, thank you. There's a question from Camelia, who's an Iranian Armenian also. She's participating from UC Merced. She asks, have you struggled with your sense of identity in terms of ethnicity? Do you consider yourself Iranian or Armenian or both? In other words, when it comes to feeling the sense of belonging, is it an either or situation?
Thank you, Camelia. That's a great question. Whenever I give, I started giving talks about this book since 2018 or even before that. And 2018, I specifically remember because I gave a talk at UCLA and I had majority Armenian students who came to the talk from Armenian language class. And they were all asking me to give them the tools to negotiate their identity. And they were not all Iranian Armenians. They were Armenians from everywhere. And I had no tools to give them. And to this day, I don't have any tools to give anyone. I can tell you that it has been difficult. And yes, you struggle with, the sense of belonging and identity. But generally, I do, I have been trained in comparative literature. When people are trained in comparative literature, they come from this background of very flexible mind and heart. Like it is the most interdisciplinary training that you receive and you become that. So for me, in any discussion, not just, the Iranian Armenian diaspora, nothing is either or. It's always and both. or an amalgamation of everything. I don't hyphenate my identity also, and I explain that in the book because of that either or, because when you hyphenate, it's as if you are either Iranian or Armenian, you're separating it. And there is also my American one, right? So I don't hyphenate, and I just use Iranian, Armenian, American, and sometimes intentionally I also flip them around and I say I'm American, Iranian, Armenian, because identity is not fixed. Identity is so fluid. It at some point you can be completely feeling Iranian, and at another point you can feel American, and the same for Armenian. So putting ourselves in those frameworks and boxes is not the answer, and is probably the only advice or tool I can give.
Okay, thank you. There is a question about language from Armin Gabrielian, who says, do you know of any document that characterizes the difference between Eastern and Western Armenian? The two are not so different. One basic difference is the difference in the sounds of certain letters. As for the alphabet, is very similar to Amharic language spoken in Ethiopia. Was the Armenian alphabet derived from Amharic alphabet?
I don't think so. I think or maybe probably they are very similar. When you look at their images, they're very similar. So which one was derived from which, I don't know. So I can't answer that. But they are, Amharic and Armenian alphabet are very similar. Which came first, I have no idea. I haven't read about that in my research. About the Western and Eastern dialects of Armenian, the difference is some sounds, but there is also difference in certain words, because in Iranian Armenian, or not necessarily Eastern Armenian, at least Iranian Armenian, we do have a lot of influence from Persian. And I'm guessing in the, Western Armenian, if you are in, let's say, Beirut or Lebanon, you have those influences. And then we have Armenians. I have a family member who is actually from Yerevan, Armenia, and they have influences from Russian. So those are also, influencing how you understand the language. If you're not familiar, let's say, with Russian, you're missing some of the communication there.
Okay, thank you. Myrna Duzjian asks, did you include the work of an author like Jacob Karapents, who wrote in the US until the 1990s but left Iran in the 40s? If so, I'd be curious to hear about your treatment of his work.
Unfortunately, no. The works that I used from the US, I'll just give an example. One of the main ones was Leonardo Alishan. I used his works, and sometimes it is very difficult to choose, because you also don't want the book to become a list of names or a list of authors that you're just listing because they are there. And there are so many. And because I didn't only focus on authors, I also looked at, cinema, looked at graphic art, paintings, sculpture, music. There were so many, and it's amazing because so many Iranians or even Iranian Armenians are telling me afterwards that they had no idea all these great, artists and authors even existed and were producing all this wonderful work. But it's a fine line between, becoming an encyclopedia or a book. So yeah, sadly, no, I have not used Jacob Karapents.
Yeah, and I think to your point, I think one of the things that your selection of these artists and writers is to also illuminate some of these larger themes that are unique to the Armenian Iranian experience. And sometimes, you know, depending on when they're writing and what the reception of their work was and when they came, you can see some of those things more clearly. So thank you for that.
Do you
Oh,
want me to share Leonardo Alishan's poem? That's
yeah, that's a good idea.
very beautiful poem. I don't know if anyone is familiar with his work, but he has such beautiful writing, and he used to be at
Utah, right?
Utah, Salt Lake City. So this is a poem by Alishan, Leonardo Alishan, in his book called Dancing Barefoot on Broken Glass, and he writes in English. And this is called Etymology of Exile. So you can see how he looks at, or he perceives diaspora or exile, the way that he presents it with, you know, beginning with Paradis, Persian garden, and taking us to, you know, paradise, but the paradise has so many Armenian, you know, mythology or folkloric or historical references, such as the, you know, forested mountains, or the Armenians, or the Armenians are believed to be the first Armenians who settled in the region, Euphrates and Tigris, and the womb from which arms of God the giant and God the child, you know, these are all references to Armenian basically history. And then when he comes to Armenia, he references, for example, to the Antichrist Armelius. And if you look at the meaning of Armelius, it's, you know, the Antichrist figure in Jewish eschatology, where this person or this figure is after persecutes the believers. And right after that, we have references to, you know, women and bleeding womb and the rivers, bloody rivers, which if you're Armenian and you're reading this and juxtaposing them, you can tell that this is probably reference to genocide and the, you know, Ottoman Empire and all of that. And then he references Armenia. By the end, he comes to this conclusion that Armenia is a wandering child. That is, Armenia is not only, you know, mother Armenia, but it's also a wandering child, the dispersion of Armenians across the world. And then ends it with saying that Armenia is the exiled citizen of Paradis, which can be the, you know, Persian Empire, or and at the end, he brings all of it together: Paradis, Armenia, and Paradise. So essentially very beautiful and poignant writing. You will enjoy reading some of his works.
Thank you, Claudia. Kathy Setyan says, and I don't know if you want to get into this, but she's asking about the situation in Azerbaijan today, the history of this conflict and arms from Israel. And some Armenians think that we are collateral damage in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
I hear you. I'm not a historian, and I'm not, again, a historian of Azerbaijan or Artsakh. I did include my personal reflections only in the epilogue, but I cannot speak like academically and scholarly to this.
Okay. So there's another question about language. Julianne Kapner says, can you talk more about your observations of the interactions of Eastern and Western Armenian languages in diaspora?
Well, I mean, I can only tell you about my own interaction with my hairdresser in Glendale, who was Armenian from Beirut, and I could not understand him. So I had to ask him to speak in English with me.
Oh, interesting. Okay, and then Armin Davoudian, who's a Iranian Armenian also, and a poet, is asking about in your survey of Armenian Iranian diasporic literature, if you came across any areas of contention among the different writers. Are there subjects or topics that they disagree about, like religion, nationalism, and even which language in which to write?
So thank you, Armin. That's a great question. But of course, when the authors are writing, they are not producing essays in response to each other's works. I'm reading their actual, the primary text that, of the poem or of the novel or story that they have written. Now, I don't think I have noticed anything about religion per se or nationalism, but there are works which are trying intentionally to transcend those boundaries. And that is what I call transnationalism, and that's how it became the title of the book. And there is a chapter where I talk about all those moments when they're transcending those borders, basically. There's also a chapter, the concluding chapter, where I talk about how they're negotiating their identity through their writing or their productions and creative works. Many of them refer to the fact that to have the question that I was asked earlier about that sense of belonging, how are they negotiating that sense of belonging? They are writing. For example, Azad Matian says that he finds home in his poetry. Many of them find home in their writings or in their art. So that is what I have noticed. The language that they write in, I have even had those who write in Persian. There are those who write in Armenian, and there are those in the US who wrote in English. And I don't think that would be, to me at least, it's not a point of contention. I think it might be because of an intentional choice for the audience that we are looking for. So who are we addressing? Because there are works that these authors write and are just circulated amongst Armenians and do not make any real impact on Iran's national landscape, which was one of my goals to do with this book, that, we have all these Iranian Armenians who have written in Armenian, published by Armenian publishing houses like Nairi, for example, and nobody knows about them. But they have done all this work about Iran and Iranian culture. So there's some of those that make some of them decide and write in Persian, for example, or in English later. Are you muted?
There's a comment from Valina Agbabian, who says, my grandfather was the Kat Khoda in a village in Iraq region. I wonder if your grandfather and mine knew one another. My family is proud of their Kazatsi heritage. Thank you for your lecture.
Thank you, Valina. Yes, Kazatsis are something else.
What does that mean?
From the Kazaz region of Iraq, where our families were. I don't know, probably they knew each other, if they're, the dates that they were living coincided or something. But this book, just for fun, not that I believe in that kind of nationalism and bloodline and stuff, but I did DNA ancestry tests. And for fun, I included it in the introduction as a hook to bring in the readers, but it was very interesting to receive the results. And the reason I'm telling you is because after that, now I have a profile and I get messages from people from Australia, from all over the world, telling me that we are third cousin or fourth cousin, and then we try to figure out if we know each other. I have to go to my parents and ask if they know those people. So chances are we are also, you know, acquaintances or family members.
Thank you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about any changes that you see among Armenian Iranians, like in the time that you've been here. Like, do you see a shift, either in terms of people's, you know, blending in with the larger Armenian diaspora, or do you see them at moments articulating some connection to Iran, maybe in the context of, say, woman life freedom? Or you mentioned the dynamism of identity, and I just wonder if you have observed anything in particular that you think is unique to the Armenian Iranian experience.
I mean, I think that's all that would be also an individual case. For example, one of the things that I really grappled with writing this book and tried to understand and find a solution was the waves of transnationalism, or being open to other cultures amongst Armenians, or at least Iranian Armenians. And it was interesting that I would have conversations with my 86-year-old grandma, and she was more open to other cultures than, you know, my 30-year-old cousin. And we usually think about these, you know, trends and this, you know, cultural assimilation or integration in other cultures in generational sense, and with the people who are first generation, second generation, third generation, or 1.5, we have all of those, you know better than me, Dr. Karim. But then for me, it was very confusing to see that, you know, my grandma was first generation Iranian Armenian who came to the US and was more open to, you know, socialize and even marriage with other cultures and other races than, let's say, my cousin who was, you know, who grew up in the US.
I see. Wow.
So yeah, I couldn't figure out what the reason was and why that was happening. And I have to just, you know, think that probably it's individual, you know, mentality, or
maybe also growing up in a context where you learned how to navigate you know, the idea that, like, you have a home identity, a private identity, and you have a public identity. And I see that among, say, Assyrian Iranians as well. Like they have a lot of openness because in some ways they recognize that they're a minority population in Iran, but that minority experience, whether it's informed by discrimination or a kind of pride, has given them the ability to move fluidly in a society that sometimes might overlook them, but also has a certain amount of recognition and appreciation, you know. And I think that's you know, it's both an individual thing, but I think also depends on when you grew up and what the context was. So any more questions? We have a few more minutes.
If there aren't any questions, I could show one of the
okay,
the artworks, actually,
that would be great, Claudia.
that I really like. This is by Garnik Der Hagopian, and it's a mixed media work on paper called Immigration from 1985. And if anybody knows Garnik Der Hagopian, he lives in Iran right now, and the images and the works that I shared in my book, that is by Garnik Der Hagopian, are his own courtesy. He sent them to me. So this is one of those works that I consider transnational or global work, because anybody who looks at this image speaks to them. Everybody can take some idea from this. But what makes it Armenian, distinctly Armenian, are some of the things that many people may not notice, including these places where you can see and they look like Armenian khachkar.
Oh, interesting.
And then there are like the nails, which remind us of the crucifixion, so Christianity. And then there are, I think it's been cut here, but there are skull-like shapes on the corner of this image, which look like images that we see that are left behind from the genocide period. The people's skulls put as if they built a mountain. So those are like distinct things that you look at some of these works and they're absolutely, I showed this image in my class and everyone could see something and could understand, such as the print on the, this newsprint on the nose, or the eyes being pulled and pushed from different sides. These are all like, conceptually, they are references to different things in diasporic studies. But when you look at, the details, then you see there are very specific Armenian details.
Very cool. Thank you. The last question is not really a question, but Dashiell Yardumian says, have you read this report? It's in the chat. It's an opinion piece about Armenians as a spatial and digital global nation.
I have not read it, but now I clicked on it and I promise I will read.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time with you, Professor Yaghoobi, and I just want to say thank you so much. It was wonderful and very interesting. And again, I want to invite you to read her book. It's University of Edinburgh Press. You can, I don't know how, is it in paper at all?
It published, you mean?
Paper. Is it still in hardback only?
Yes, yeah. There is
a library to buy it. Get your library to buy it.
There is also ebook.
Oh, an ebook. Okay. So thank you so much for your questions, everyone. I want to conclude before you leave by inviting you to come back next week at 4 o'clock on the 15th of November. We have another scholar, Dr. Sahar Sadeghi, who teaches sociology. Her book also just got published in the spring, called Conditional Belonging: The Racialization of Iranians in the Wake of Anti-Muslim Politics. Also another transnational study of Iranians in Germany and Iranians in the US, kind of post-79. So if you enjoyed this conversation, come back next week. Won't be Christians, be Muslims. So thank you so much for your time and your thoughtful observations and insights, and also congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. And take care, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and come back and sign up for our newsletter. We love to have people from all ethnic minority groups and all persuasions of Iranian interest. Bye, everyone.